Hello, everybody. My name is Andrew Tavukjian, and I'm going to be presenting on a long debated public health topic, genetically modified organisms or genetically modified foods that are more commonly referred to as GMOs. I hope you find it informative, insightful, and enjoyable. Genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, refer to any organism that has been subject to genetic bioengineering and manipulation with the intention of introducing a new trait or a unique new feature. The term GMO can apply to any organism, but it is generally addressed as a concept in the food and agriculture industries, so it can also be appropriately called genetically modified foods. The common objectives behind GMOs are centered around possessing a greater sense of control over different production aspects, such as improving overall or specific quality of the product itself, increasing product yield and consistency, and increasing overall value of your product. While these are some of the driving factors, GMOs have also become a leading and promising candidate as a potential solution to addressing the extent of global food insecurities. To this day, several aspects both for and against GMOs continue to be debated in academic and public settings, with some overlapping areas of examination, such as its public health implications, its impact on agriculture and economics, that work to serve both sides of the argument. Therefore, the aim of this presentation is really to examine multiple facets surrounding the debate on continued usage of genetically modified organisms or foods, and to ultimately draw some conclusions based on the most effective recommendations for its future. Just for some additional background here, the modern application of GMO usage began in the early 1990s, but some claim that its origins date as far back as 10,500 to 10,100 BC. There is some documentation of farmers practicing artificial breeding selection that was really aimed at capitalizing on their preferential outcomes for their wide array of products. With all that in mind, though, GMO usage gained a lot of traction on a commercial scale between 1994 and 1996, and has since been a very popular subject of global ethical debate for its potential harmful implications on human and environmental health. That being said, both the pros and cons that actively drive this discussion arguably require constant, renewed consideration to maintain the most up-to-date policies and procedures aimed at preserving health and safety in all aspects. In looking at some of the arguments being made about GMOs, we of course have to start with the good things. So, since its commercial inception about 3 decades ago, the usage of GMOs has become a lot clearer of a concept in terms of what exactly it is and what its purpose entails. Similarly, the increased popularity of GMOs has also kickstarted extensive research and debate that encompasses different principles of the agricultural industry on both a local and global scale. It should be noted, however, that some aspects still lack concrete examination and are generally considered presumptive. Nevertheless, GMOs have demonstrated several promising benefits through a handful of common practices with some interconnected public health, economic, and industrial implications. For all intents and purposes here, for this analysis, crops will be used as the primary example when referring to GMOs. A few highlights of some of the practices and goals involving GMO utilization can be seen here: enhanced resistance to pests, decreased reliance on pesticides, and improve nutritional value and the things that can come with it. So starting with the enhanced resistance, this is one of the most common genetic modifications carried out in crops. Enhanced resistance really to all kinds of external damages, such as microorganism infection, herbivorous predators, and herbicides themselves. Increasing defenses in crops comes with a myriad of benefits that cover several critical disciplines, each cascading into the next. As a start, one of the one of the most important factors to consider is how GMOs may impact human health. In genetically reducing the likelihood of any external foul play onto crops, humans are therefore less likely to consume any foods that have been contaminated by microbes or pests or any harmful chemicals used in their maintenance. Through this increased resistance, farmers would also have a lessened reliance on having to use pesticides and should inherently see an increase in product yield due to lowered experienced losses in their product, therefore having a agricultural and economic appeal to productivity. This presumptive extended life expectancy of crops would also imply that less tilling would be required for routine maintenance, which serves to cut additional costs to farmers and improves environmental health through the reduction of fossil fuel, diesel usage, which really is working on lowering your overall carbon footprint and preventing unnecessary soil erosion. As briefly mentioned when discussing enhanced resistances, we move on to a reduced dependency of pesticide use. The greater defenses in crops would also indicate that less pesticides would need to be used as a means of pest management. A lowered application of pesticides would cut back on the need to turn over fields, which again reduces dependency on fossil fuels and overall carbon footprint. From an economic standpoint, less pesticide usage cuts costs on farmers, thus increasing their profit margins for their products. This lowered reliance on spraying harmful pesticides would also imply a lesser likelihood of harmful chemical exposure to farmers themselves and any nearby residential areas, thus removing a common source of risk to human health. Similarly, the reduced reliance on pesticides would also indicate less harmful residues lingering in the environment that would otherwise contribute to air pollution and that can leach into the water supplies and fertilizers. Lastly, reduction of pesticide use also serves to conserve the presence of beneficial insects that otherwise naturally aid in the cultivation of crops. So last but certainly not least, we have the idea of nutritional value in crops. The utilization of GMOs allows us to possess the ability to artificially increase nutritional value in products. Staple crops such as rice, corn, and wheat are really big food sources for most parts of the world, but they are lacking in critical nutritional value. GMO practices can offer a potential means of genetically enhancing crops to possess higher levels of vitamins, minerals, unsaturated fats, and essential amino acids aimed at introducing a better diet in consumers. Doing so will not only bring a higher nutritional content to the general population, but will also work to ensure that the same will come to those that live in developing countries where these staple crops are consumed in significant quantities. In underdeveloped countries, issues of access to varied diets creates food insecurities to the masses, allowing for malnutrition and its associated resulting diseases to run rampant as serious public health concerns. So through greater penetration of GMOs to these areas, there is a potential to improve overall sustainability and decrease malnutrition on a global scale. The aforementioned topics encompass three of the largest factors that are in support of GMOs. As such, a larger portion of the scientific community seems to be in favor of the continued utilization of GMOs. However, there are a handful of European and Asian countries that have issued outright bans for GMOs due to strong negative opinions on the subject from citizens and farmers alike. Some of these concerns have presumptive consequences, currently have limited study, or apply mainly to the farming practices themselves rather than the actual GMOs. Nevertheless, a few of the notable aspects pertaining to GMOs that pose valid concerns can be seen here, the biggest being, of course, human health concerns, then loss in biodiversity, and creation of pest resistance. So on the topic of human health, it really presents the largest area of discussion when it comes to the consumption of GMOs. Although there are currently limited studies on any direct harms to human health, one of the biggest concerns is the possible transfer of antibiotic resistance genes into the GI tract upon consumption. Antibiotic genes are very commonly used as tracers to help identify traits during any kind of genetic engineering. In the event a transfer such as this does occur, this could potentially allow gut bacteria to develop antibiotic resistance and acquire the capability to pose harm to humans. There are some studies that discuss increased risk to diseases such as Parkinson's, hepatitis C, and multiple sclerosis following the consumption of GMOs, but again, these and other topics focused on human health are still overall unconfirmed and demonstrate no apparent threats to safety in humans. Any unintended and long-term effects to consuming GMOs are yet to be discovered, making future study in this area extremely critical. Another area of concern in shifting to greater GMO reliance is the impact on biodiversity and ecosystems. A lot of critics argue that a widespread implementation of GMOs can drive displacement of native plant species that currently already exist in a given environment, which would decrease the overall genetic diversity in that same area. Additionally, through cross-pollination of GMOs with wild species, there is a chance of introducing novel traits such as herbicide resistance or some form of a toxin as a form of defense into other native crops, which can lead to detrimental environmental and biodiversity effects. Lastly, the simplicity that can often be associated with GMO farming can make it easier for monocultures to develop. Monocultures can indirectly lessen existing genetic diversity and gradually lead to an increased vulnerability to pests and diseases within that population over time. Last, but certainly not least, the concern is a pest resistance, and it's as scary as it sounds. In looking back at the positives, I brought up two of the most important benefits, or the most notable benefits: enhanced crop defenses and reduction of pesticide usage. As critical as their implications may be, however, they also come with the possibility of inadvertently promoting the development of pest resistance. Ironically enough, through implementing pest resistance in GMOs and limiting pesticide usage for routine maintenance, you're indirectly creating high levels of selection pressure for these pests to essentially evolve or die. So GMO usage can potentially force insect populations to evolve more quickly than normal, and these improved pests can, in theory, overcome the defenses in place and continue to wreak havoc on crops. As a result, newer pesticides may have to once again be utilized to adapt to these evolutionary changes, imposing additional challenges and costs to farmers, and reintroduces human and environmental health risks. So you're basically back at square one. But again, to reiterate, the literature tells us that these concerns are theoretical at this time, since no formal studies have been conducted to verify whether it will actually happen, but they are important considerations nonetheless. In considering both the pros and cons around the GMO debate, the general scientific consensus seems to lean more in favor of GMOs becoming a more prominent and permanent aspect in agriculture to address several facets of public health. For the time being, GMOs demonstrate great potential for providing a safe and sustainable means of agricultural prowess and improving on food security around the world. That being the case, several factors that surround the topic of GMOs would need to be addressed. The most obvious and arguably the most important deciding factor for the future of GMOs is greater research and study of its potential long-term effects. As it stands, most negative implications are preliminary and inconclusive and mainly serve as a means of asking the hard questions. The fears associated with possible threats to human health and biodiversity should be the center of focus in this research, exploring ways to ensure that the chances of antibiotic or pesticide resistance, for example, are kept to a minimum, if not completely out of the equation. A better grasp over these potential concerns should be continuous in case current information changes and necessary warnings need to be issued, which would indirectly work to quell public concerns and maintain a sense of trust and transparency between the professional side and the public. This also ties into another common roadblock cited by many experts in meeting the intended goals behind GMOs, and that's lack of public acceptance. Public skepticism will likely always be present when it comes to GMOs, largely in part to the type of media coverage it receives. Encouraging fair and neutral dissemination of information about GMOs could potentially contribute to a more organic understanding of its implications, be it positive or negative. To close out, it's very likely that the debate around GMOs is going to continue for the foreseeable future, and rightfully so. Having only been under the microscope for about 3 decades, there's a lot of potential for new breakthroughs all the time, and always the possibility of changing what we already know. The support for GMOs is greatly driven by the prospect of tackling global food insecurity, and as of now, the professional consensus is more neutral or in acceptance of GMOs, since there have yet to be any severe or immediate negative effects that come from the GMOs themselves. Some concerns do have tangible detriments in the eyes of the public, while others are still presumptive yet valid. However, most of the key highlights of the arguments hold GMO usage in a high scientific esteem. Nevertheless, the full extent of this topic is something that requires careful attention in the years to come to observe any potential long-term effects to be able to confidently deem GMOs as a safe means of food production. Even then, however, it's important to take all positive findings with a grain of salt before writing it off as a success, especially when it comes to any work involving the genetic code. Thanks so much for tuning in to my presentation on GMOs. I hope you enjoyed the content and received some good takeaways on the different perspectives surrounding the controversy. Have a good evening.